Ben Jacobs of Wittenberg to Westphalia. How are you, sir?
I'm doing all right, getting by. Yourself?
Not too bad also. We're living trying times, but I don't think I've had the COVID, and if I have, I'm asymptomatic. What about you?
I'm thinking everyone in my house had it. But we've had three. The only person who showed real strong symptoms, like having trouble breathing, had three negative tests, which may say something about the accuracy of the tests, to be honest. So we'll see what happens when they get the blood tests going.
Ben, I think I know the answer to the question I'm going to ask you, but the question which I have to ask, Wittenberg and Westphalia, what's so important about both of those places other than they're both in modern day Germany?
Well, if you put me in a room with Zach Twomley, you could have a long discussion about how they're not important. But Wittenberg is the place where Martin Luther began his pontificating and nailed up his 95 Theses, thus sparking off the Protestant Reformation. And Westphalia is, well, I guess I should say, that Reformation ended up causing a series of wars, which sort of ended with the Treaty of Westphalia and the related treaties that were signed around that conference. But so really the show is about the wars of the Protestant Reformation as a look at the way Europe developed in the early modern period.
So really what your podcast covers is the kind of the political ramification, the center of Europe, which lead to the modern world as we know it.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Right. Why did Ben Jacobs, an American with a big bushy beard, why do you find that period of history so fascinating?
Partly because just it's so important and we never covered it in school in any capacity. It's sort of the kind of thing, yeah, or not even school, like if you just relied on pop culture history or anything like that, you'd never learn about the 30 Years' War or anything like that. And it, to a certain extent, contextualizes the behavior of Germany in the 20th century. Certainly doesn't excuse it, but it contextualizes it, that they have this history of intervention from all over Europe. And so the one hand, it isn't really understood well, especially in the English-speaking world. Second, I wanted a podcast that no one else was doing anything on. And then I think the third thing is just it's an interesting story to try and figure out how to tell. I don't know if everyone would say that I'm telling it exactly right, but it's a story where there are no good guys, and if you think there are good guys, by the end you will be pretty sure that there are no good guys. Everyone seems to be a bad guy, and yet at the same time, it's not like they're cartoon villains twirling their mustaches and flying zeppelins around or anything. There's a method to the madness, but it very much does become madness by the end. And that's interesting to try and figure out.
How exactly are you telling the story? Is it strictly chronological? Are you just looking at political events? Are you looking at society? Give us that broad sweep of actually how you approach the subject of Wittenberg to Westphalia.
I'm doing kind of a compound approach. When I get to the story, I like to tell stories in order. But there's a lot of context that I think is very important. Right now, I'm still doing the background. I'm 5 years into the show. I'm on my 64th episode right now. And I still haven't started the show, really. I've told a couple stories, but right now I'm doing sort of a history of the culture of medieval Europe kind of thing. But I'm about to start hitting the real prologue of the show,
Mhm.
which is going to be the investiture controversy between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. And then that pretty quickly over the course of a couple centuries brings us to the start of the actual events of the show. Once I get there, I am planning on sticking to narrative as much as possible. But the other thing is that the wars of the Protestant Reformation just hop all over the place. They're not one war. There's in some way it's all one big war, and in some ways it's a series of wars that were just constantly happening in parallel all over Europe. So it's I know what I'm doing now, and I know what I'm going to be doing, but it's going to be interesting once I actually get to starting the show to figuring out how I'm actually going to tell that story.
Well, we have a comment from Ryan that
Yes.
our fellow podcast. He says, "So we've had 64 episodes of background, Ben."
Yes. Yeah, probably. I'm probably the only person who has rivaled Ryan for thoroughness.
So, give us a sense chronologically of how long the period is from Wittenberg to the Treaty of Westphalia.
So, if we just stick within those bounds, it's 1517 to 1648.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Yeah.
And with my kind of high school history hat on, the Treaty of Westphalia, it's the end of the 30 Years' War, and really that's the start of the nation state kind of in Europe ish, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ish, but yes. I
Yeah.
mean,
Okay.
certainly by the end of it, arguably going into the war, England and France were already state-like.
Mhm.
By the end of it, you've definitely got England and France and a bunch of the other powers of Europe that have formed something that we would recognize as something like a modern state.
I must admit, I once bored somebody at a dinner party with. I tried to be really clever, and they said that before 1648 there were no nation states in Europe. Now, tell me if I'm wrong here, Ben, because England, most obviously, I would say France probably not, because they still had the various regions of France still had their own parliaments or estates, right? So it was still relatively decentralized, and still the France of 1648 doesn't go all the way to the Rhine. So it doesn't even quite look like modern day France. He still had a papal fief in the south. Go with me. Go with me. Right.
Okay.
His eyes rolled in the back of his head and whatever. Portugal, definitely a state. Spain, not. Right. Because, all the different regions still had their own parliaments. Holland or the Netherlands, definitely a state. Denmark and Sweden. Discuss.
Well, so the thing is, England had its own regional parliaments until what, 1830 something? I'm forgetting the date of the Act of Union now.
Oh, you're getting England's mixed up with your
Well,
United
sure.
Kingdom of Great Britain
Okay,
and
yeah.
Northern Ireland. So no, sir. No, sir. Act of Union 1707 with Scotland.
1707. Okay, right.
Right, so
So, but you had
England was a nation state.
England, yes, but England also theoretically dominated Ireland, which had its own parliament. I mean, both England and France, I would say, were half in, half out. And the parliaments of France, the Parlement, started out like their parliament were like similar to the English Parliament of the time, but they radically diverged shortly thereafter, with the French Parliament becoming more judicial bodies, whereas the British Parliament obviously becoming a governing assembly after they cut off the king's head. The issue isn't these specific political structures that may or may not have existed. It's how centralized was power, how present was the bureaucracy. How one of the big things in any discussion of whether something's a state or not is the monopoly on the use of force. And France and England, arguably, there were still nobles who could raise private forces theoretically, but especially after after Louis XIV, that became harder and harder just financially.
Yeah.
The sort of last hurrah of that in England and France was in 1688, which is why my show is actually going to go until 1688 or thereabouts. But you did have nobles could sort of raise private militaries, but what are you going to do with them at this point? You need hundreds, tens of thousands of men to make a dent in royal power. You need artillery. You're starting to need an industrial base and a logistical support base, and so that's why there are strong ties between the development of the military and the modern state system. What those ties are is a subject of debate that I'm going to be covering in the show, but it's Brittany, as much as it had its own parliament, wasn't going to fight the King of France on anything.
Gotcha. So, do you want to know a fun fact?
Sure.
There is one private army in the United Kingdom. There's a Scottish Lord, Laird, Duke, somebody who is allowed by law to still levy his own troops. And I think, obviously, they're all just ceremonial, but he has like 5 or 6 or so. but I had completely forgotten about this arcane fact until you're talking about being able, one of the key criteria of the nation state. So Wittenberg to Westphalia is a marker in time. It's you don't just focus on Middle Europe. It's not fundamentally about the Holy Roman Empire, but so is this fundamentally all about from Germany westwards? Are we forgetting the Balkans because they're under the Ottoman domain right then? Are we forgetting the Russian Empire? Is this Western Europe basically?
Eastern Europe is very important to this story. The part of the reason that Protestantism was able to get a foothold and survive partly was the political disorganization of the Holy Roman Empire. But part of why the Holy Roman Empire was disorganized is that the Holy Roman Emperor was busy fighting the Ottomans in the Balkans and everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
He was facing 2 directions, and all the monarchs of Europe had started centralizing, and the Holy Roman Emperor was not only included in that list, he was one of the first to start making steps in that direction. But that whole process was derailed by having to fight constant wars and trying to maintain domain. Ultimately, with the Habsburgs controlling the Holy Roman Empire and Spain and Spanish Empire, the attention was getting dragged in too many different directions, and the centralizing reforms weren't able to complete properly, I guess you might say. And so that is really because the emperor was distracted when a bunch of princes in the Holy Roman Empire decided that they were no longer Catholics. He didn't have the military wherewithal to come back and smack them down and start burning people. And that's a very important part of the story. So what the Ottomans were doing is important. The Holy Roman Empire's eastern frontier was Poland, and what was going on between the Poles and the Crusaders in the Baltic and the Russians. That's also very important. Often ignored by Western historians, unfortunately, but has a whole lot of really interesting modern day consequences, because the personal union of Poland and Lithuania is one of the main things that allowed the Pale of Jewish settlement to take root in Eastern Europe, which is where most Ashkenazi Jews families comes from, because they were getting kicked out of Western Europe, so they ended up settling down there. So there's all these interesting links out to the east as well. The Holy Roman Empire was definitely not in a vacuum, And then, of course, Sweden ended up landing on the Holy Roman Empire like a bunch of bricks dropped from a very large building. So
Gustavus Adolphus. What are you going to do when you get to the Glorious Revolution, 1688? What are you going to do? You're going to hang up your podcasting mic and just call it a day, or you're going to discover another period of world history to investigate?
Well, if I still have first of all, I had two clear things that I had sketched out when I was going into this. I had the introduction, I had the conclusion, and then I had a pretty decent sketch of what was going to go in the middle. But the introduction and the conclusion were the things that were clearest in my mind. And the conclusion is going to start at 1688. And I'm 64 episodes into the introduction, so the conclusion may take quite a while. That said, if I still have any energy left for podcasting in 15 years when I'm done with this, there are plenty of other topics out there that I would love to talk about. If there's any room left in the history podcasting landscape at that point. And of course, I might do a podcast about urban planning at some point, which is actually my day job and something I'm fairly interested in.
Very quick question, Charles Scott Kimball. What video conferencing technology is being used here? Skype or Zoom? Neither, sir. We're using StreamYard, which seems to be holding up pretty well and looks quite slick. Obviously, Ben, we're talking because not only do you have a podcast, but you're one of the workers behind Intelligent Speech. Why do you think it's important that you have you and your podcast have a presence at Intelligent Speech this year?
Well, it's a lot of fun. I'm sure I can come up with a better answer, but that's the right one. I am an instinctive but not well thought out believer in intelligent educational podcast content. I think we intelligent podcasters have a lot to contribute for people who need free content like this, and I think getting us together in a space, even if it's virtual, to talk about stuff helps bring out differences, similarities, ways we do things. It's always an interesting time, and everybody tends to leave enlightened and uplifted by the process, although when you host the conference, sometimes they leave with a hangover too.
And what are you going to be presenting? Are you going to be doing any roundtable panels? What exactly is your involvement going to be on the day?
So I decided I wanted to take it easy on myself this year since, as you know, I've been helping set this whole thing up. I've got a toddler, I've got a day job and everything. So I decided to only do roundtables and panels because then I wouldn't have to do as much work. And I ended up doing 4 of them. So I'm doing a lot of work. I'm moderating a panel on medieval history. That's sort of the most straightforward, nice tie into my podcast.
Yeah.
I'm moderating a panel on STEM subjects because there was no one else to moderate it. Right. But it should be a great panel. There's a bunch of great people who are going to be on it. And so that should be fun. Then I'm doing a panel discussion with Raven Forrest of the Tiny Vampires podcast on public health and how it's shaped modern cities. So my day job there, to a certain extent. And then Ryan Stitt and I are going to be doing a talk on ancient and medieval cities. So that's a
combination of your day job with your podcast.
Exactly. So I should say we had a talk last night and changed the topic slightly to ancient and Renaissance cities, because there's a nice philosophical tie there between ancient Greek philosophers and their philosophies of urban planning, and then what the Renaissance people did with it, which was often terrible. So,
well, what they did with it might have been terrible, but I know that number one, your podcast isn't, and your presentations and your moderation of the roundtables won't be. Ben Jacobs, thank you for being part of Intelligent Speech, and also thank you for doing these little 20-minute little mini episodes to which help to go and preview your podcast and what you're going to do. Thank you, sir. You take care and stay safe.
You too.